Three separate government officials searched Laura's apartment on the same morning, and not one of them found what they were looking for. She sat in a gray waiting room afterward, a paper cup of bad coffee going cold in her hands, and she thought about how calm she felt. Not the calm of someone who has nothing to hide, the calm of someone who already moved everything that matters. The original tape was gone from her apartment before they arrived. She'd made sure of that. What they tore apart for 4 hours was a carefully maintained illusion of a life that still had secrets left in it. Here's the thing nobody tells you about inheriting a secret. You don't feel the weight of it right away. It comes later, slowly, like water finding its way through a wall you thought was solid. Laura had grown up thinking her grandfather Martin was just a quiet man. The kind of man who shows up to family dinners, eats without complaint, answers questions with the shortest possible answer, and then looks out the window. She loved him the way you love furniture that's always been in the room. You don't think about it. It's just there, until it isn't. He died on a Tuesday in early spring. Not dramatically, not with any last words she was present for. She got the call while she was stuck in traffic, and by the time she arrived at his place, the room already had that particular stillness that tells you something has permanently left it. She sat beside him for a while anyway. That felt right. It was 3 days later that she found the box. Not hidden, exactly. Just tucked under the bed with the kind of casual placement that either means nothing or means everything. A metal box, military surplus by the look of it, scratched and dented and locked with a combination she had no way of knowing. She almost left it for the estate process. Almost. She picked it up. It was lighter than she expected, which somehow made it worse. Heavy things contain obvious things. Clothes, tools, papers. Light things contain choices. She got it open eventually, using a method she's not going to detail here. And what she found inside stopped her completely. No photographs, no letters, no documents or certificates or any of the ordinary paper trail a life leaves behind. Just a cassette tape, old enough that the label had started to peel, and a single index card with her grandfather's handwriting on it. 7 words. Wait until they stop watching you. She stood there in his bedroom for a long time, holding that card, smelling the specific smell of his space, old wood, and something faintly metallic she'd never been able to identify. She looked at the tape, she looked at the card again, and she thought, who exactly is they? She found out faster than she expected. Within 2 weeks of Martin's death, before she'd told anyone about the tape, before she'd even found a working cassette player to listen to it on, she noticed things. A car parked outside her building 3 days running, different plates each time, but the same small dent in the rear bumper. A phone call where someone stayed on the line for 10 seconds without speaking before hanging up. A colleague at work who mentioned, too casually, that someone had been asking about her. Not by name, he said, just describing her, asking what she was working on lately. She'd listened to the tape by then, alone, at 2 in the morning, with every curtain closed and her phone in the other room. And what she heard in her grandfather's voice, calm and deliberate and clearly recorded in full awareness of what he was doing, made the car outside and the silent phone calls feel like exactly what they were. A reminder, a message without words. We know you have it. We're deciding what to do about you. The waiting room was fluorescent and smelled like printer toner and carpet cleaner. An official across a desk explained to Laura that the search had been a routine matter related to her grandfather's former employment status, that everything was in order, that she was free to go. He smiled the kind of smile that is technically a smile. She smiled back, thanked him, walked out into the gray morning air with the tape already safely elsewhere, and the knowledge that whatever Martin had recorded all those years ago, someone in a government building with bad lighting was still losing sleep over it. That was the moment she understood. Her grandfather hadn't been quiet all his life because he was a quiet man. He'd been quiet because he'd made a calculation, and he'd stuck to it for decades, and now the calculation had passed to her. If this story already has you hooked, subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps this reach people who need to hear what comes next. She went home, made coffee, and pressed play again from the beginning. Martin's voice filled the room, and he started, not where she expected, not with what he saw or what he found, but with the morning he decided to sign a document he should never have touched, in an office he should never have walked into, for a project that, as far as the official record was concerned, never happened at all. His voice on the tape was steady, unhurried, the voice of a man who had thought very carefully about what order to tell things in and why. She turned up the volume. Outside, a car she didn't recognize idled at the curb for exactly 4 minutes, then pulled away without stopping. Martin began to speak about a locked metal case that a government contractor had carried into his office one winter morning, and how the man had set it on the desk between them without opening it, and how that single detail, the case staying closed, had told Martin everything he needed to know about what kind of offer was coming. He took it anyway. And in the recording, his voice didn't carry regret exactly. It carried something quieter and harder to name. The particular tone of a man explaining a decision he understood completely, even if he wished, somewhere underneath all that understanding, that he had been a different kind of person on that particular morning. The contractor who walked into Martin's office that morning had no name on his badge, just a number. Martin noticed that immediately, the way you notice a missing step on a staircase, your foot expecting something that isn't there. The man was unremarkable in every visible way. Medium height, gray coat, the kind of face that doesn't leave an impression. But he moved through the office like someone who had already decided how the conversation would end before it started. He set the metal case on the desk. He did not open it. He sat down across from Martin and laid out the offer in a flat, unhurried voice, the way you'd read items off a grocery list. A remote project, a wilderness zone in the far north, a team of specialists, all vetted, all cleared, a communications blackout for the full duration. Armed personnel on site, described as standard procedure for remote operations in restricted terrain, a contract period of several years, and a payment figure that Martin later said felt less like a salary and more like a message. The number was saying, "This is how serious we are. This is how much we need you specifically to say yes." Martin was good at his work. He'd spent years doing structural assessments in conditions most engineers refused, reading landscapes the way other people read text, understanding load and stress, and the hidden logic of how things hold together or fall apart. He was, in the contractor's words, exactly the profile they needed. He asked 2 questions. What exactly would he be assessing? And why the blackout? The contractor answered neither directly. He said the nature of the materials on site required specialist interpretation. He said the communications restriction was a condition of the project's security classification and was non-negotiable. Then he slid a single sheet of paper across the desk, face down, and said Martin could read it, or he could decline now, and they'd both move on with their day. Martin turned it over. It was not a contract. It was an acknowledgement form. By signing, he confirmed he understood that the project existed under a specific security classification, that discussing it with anyone outside the approved chain was a serious offense, and that signing the full contract would be contingent on a background review that had, the form noted at the bottom, already been completed. They'd already checked him out before walking through his door. The offer wasn't really an offer. It was a notification. He should have said no. He knew it the same way you know a storm is coming before the sky has fully changed. Something in the air shifts. Something in your chest tightens by a fraction. Martin felt that. He signed anyway, because the number on that offer meant clearing every debt he had, and then some, because he was 34 years old and had spent a decade doing careful, competent, invisible work, because the locked case sitting between them suggested that whatever was up there was genuinely unlike anything he'd assessed before, and some part of him, the part that became an engineer in the first place, needed to know what was in it. The contractor picked up the signed form, put it in the case, closed it, stood up, and said someone would contact Martin within the week with travel arrangements. He was out of the office in under 3 minutes. He left no card, no contact number, nothing. Martin sat at his desk for a long time after that. The room felt different with the man gone, like the air pressure had changed slightly. He looked at the space where the case had been. He thought about the badge with no name on it. He thought about the background check that was already done. He thought about the word non-negotiable and how many times it had appeared in that short conversation without being said directly. Then he went home, made dinner, and didn't sleep well. Which, he said on the tape, should have told him everything. The travel arrangements came 4 days later. Not by phone. An envelope slid under his office door sometime overnight. Inside, a handwritten itinerary with no letterhead, no return address, and a departure time 3 weeks out. At the bottom of the page, 2 sentences. Inform no one of your destination or duration. This copy should be destroyed after memorization. Martin did not destroy it. He memorized it, then folded it very carefully and put it in a book on his shelf, a thick technical manual nobody would ever open. Laura found it there decades later, still folded, still legible, the handwriting precise and slightly too neat, the kind of neat that comes from deliberate effort rather than natural habit. She held it under the light for a long time, thinking about her grandfather standing in his office reading those two sentences, and what it meant that he'd kept it anyway. The journey north took longer than Martin had expected, and stranger. First, by regular transport, the kind with other passengers and engine noise, and the ordinary smell of people going places. Then, a transfer to a smaller vehicle with blacked-out rear windows. Then another transfer, further out, into terrain that the road had not been built for. The landscape outside changed in ways Martin tracked carefully, because tracking things was what he did. The tree density shifted. The quality of light shifted. The horizon started doing something he couldn't immediately name. A flatness that felt wrong, too consistent, like the land ahead had been pressed down by something. By the time they reached the final staging point, a low, prefabricated structure in a clearing with no visible markings, Martin hadn't seen another unaffiliated human being in 4 days. The crew assembled there were 7 other men, none of whom offered last names, all of whom had the same look Martin suspected he was wearing himself. The look of someone who has made a decision and is now living in the gap between making it and finding out what it costs. The armed escorts were already present. 4 of them. They did not carry themselves like site security. They carried themselves like people whose job was specifically to manage the people they were guarding. Martin noticed the difference immediately and said nothing. They moved out the following morning. What came next, Martin said on the tape, was the part he had rehearsed telling 100 times in his head and never once found the right words for. The structures appeared through the tree line without warning. One moment, there was forest. The next moment, there was something else entirely. Something that the word structure does not come close to covering. Something that made Martin stop walking mid-step and stand completely still in the freezing air while his brain did something he had never felt it do before. It simply refused. The closest structure was wider than any building Martin had ever assessed in his entire career, and it was not a building. He stood at the edge of the tree line and looked at it the way you look at something your eyes are sending to your brain, but your brain is quietly sending back with a note attached that says try again. His engineering instincts, the part of him that automatically started calculating load and mass and structural logic the moment he looked at anything man-made, went completely silent, not because there was nothing to calculate, because there was too much, and none of it resolved into anything he had language for. The surface facing him was gray-brown and vertical, rising so high that the top of it disappeared into the low cloud sitting over the site. He couldn't see where it ended. He could only see where it began, at ground level, where the base met the frozen earth with a solidity that looked less like something that had grown there and more like something that had always been there, before the soil, before the rock beneath the soil, before whatever came before that. Then he saw the pattern. He walked toward it without deciding to. His feet just moved. The surface of the structure was covered in a repeating geometric shape, hexagons, each one roughly the size of a dinner plate, covering every centimeter of the visible surface in a grid so precise that Martin, who had spent a decade working with precision instruments, could not find a single deviation from the pattern with his naked eye. Not one hexagon was larger than its neighbor. Not one edge was softer or harder than the one beside it. The pattern simply continued, uniform and total, in every direction he looked. He pressed his palm flat against the surface. It was cold, the way stone is cold, but with something underneath the cold that he couldn't name, a faint resistance, like pressing against something that was very slightly pushing back, not moving, just present. The texture under his hand was neither rough nor smooth, but something in between that felt deliberate, engineered, the way the grip surface of a precision tool feels deliberate. He looked down at his palm after pulling it away, completely clean. No dust, no residue, no transfer of any kind. In a wilderness site with months of weather and debris, that surface had collected nothing. Dr. Feld appeared at his shoulder. Martin hadn't heard him approach. The man had a way of materializing in your peripheral vision without announcing himself, which Martin had already decided he found deeply unpleasant. Feld looked at the surface, then at Martin, then back at the surface. He said, in his flat, careful voice, that Martin should begin his structural assessment of the base section and work upward. He said it the way someone says something they have already said many times to many different people, a sentence worn smooth from repetition. Martin asked how old the structures were. Feld said that question was outside the scope of Martin's assessment. Martin asked what the hexagonal patterning indicated in terms of material composition. Feld said that question was also outside the scope of Martin's assessment. Martin looked at him for a moment and understood something clearly. Feld already knew the answers. He wasn't withholding them because they were classified in the ordinary sense of the word. He was withholding them because he had decided or been told that the crew would function better without them, that some information was stabilizing and some information was the opposite, and Feld had placed the answers to those two questions very firmly in the second category. The cutting work began the next morning. The equipment brought to the site was industrial grade, the kind used for the hardest known materials. It lasted less than a day before the first set of blades had to be replaced. Martin watched the cutting team work and tracked the blade consumption rate in his notebook with the same automatic precision he tracked everything. By the end of the first week, he had a number. They were destroying more cutting equipment per day than a standard crew would use in 2 full months of normal operation. He showed the number to Feld. Feld looked at it, nodded once, and wrote something in his own notebook without sharing what. The material did not cut so much as it resisted cutting until a threshold was crossed, and then it released, in sections, with a sound Martin described on the tape as something between a crack and a tone, a sound that had pitch to it, that lingered in the air for a few seconds after the cut, like the last note of something. Weeks passed before they broke fully through the outer layer on the first structure. When they did, what they found inside stopped 3 men mid-movement and held them there in complete silence. The interior material was darker than the outer layer by several shades, almost black in certain light, with a grain so regular and so fine that it looked less like organic matter and more like something that had been produced rather than grown. Martin ran his fingers along the exposed interior surface and felt the grain direction with his fingertips the way a craftsman reads wood. It was perfectly consistent. No deviation, no knot, no variation of any kind over the entire exposed face. He'd never felt anything like it. Not in 34 years of working with structural materials. And then one of the crew members called out from further along the structure, his voice carrying a tone that was not quite alarm and not quite excitement, but sat precisely between the two. He'd found something inside the material, not on the surface, inside it, visible through a crack in the interior layer that the cutting had opened. Something that the material had grown around, or been built around. It was impossible to say which. Something that caught what little gray light reached that far into the sight and held it. Martin moved toward the voice without thinking, and what he saw when he got there was the thing that changed the register of the entire operation from strange to something he didn't have a word for. It was warm, not the surface, not the air around it. The thing inside the crack was warm, radiating heat that Martin could feel from 30 centimeters away in air that was sitting well below freezing. He held his hand near it and felt the heat on his skin like standing near a lamp, steady, constant, sourceless. In a structure that had been standing in a wilderness with no power, no fuel, no mechanism for heat generation that Martin could identify or even imagine, something inside it was warm. He looked at Feld, who had appeared again at the edge of the group. Feld was already writing in his notebook. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man checking a box next to something he had fully expected to find but was not permitted to be relieved about. That night, Martin lay in his bunk and looked at the ceiling of the prefab sleeping unit and listened to the silence outside. It was a complete silence, the kind you only get in genuinely remote places where there are no roads, no machinery, no human activity of any kind to produce background noise. He lay in that silence and thought about the heat coming from inside a dead structure in a frozen wilderness. And he thought about the fact that Feld had not looked surprised. About 6 weeks into the operation, Martin woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of Dr. Feld's voice coming through the wall of the sleeping unit, and what stopped him cold was not the hour and not the low, urgent tone, but the fact that there was no radio equipment at the site capable of reaching anyone outside. Martin lay completely still and listened. The wall between their units was thin prefab panel, the kind that transmits sound clearly if the other person is speaking above a whisper. Feld was not whispering. He was speaking in a controlled, precise voice, the kind of voice you use when you are choosing every word carefully because the person on the other end needs exact information and you cannot afford to be misunderstood. Martin could hear the cadence of it, but not all the words. He caught fragments. Thermal consistency confirmed. He caught secondary formations matched the northern survey. He caught one phrase completely, spoken slightly louder than the rest, as if Feld had leaned forward or turned in a way that briefly aimed his voice directly at the partition. The phrase was, "We cannot rule out active function." Then silence. Then the sound of Feld moving around his unit. Then nothing. Martin lay there in the dark and thought about the words active function applied to structures that had been standing in an uninhabited wilderness for longer than any explanation he'd been given could account for. Active function meant whatever these things were built to do, they were still doing it. The warmth wasn't residual. It wasn't a geological anomaly or a trick of insulation. Something inside those structures was still running. He didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, he watched Feld at breakfast, and Feld was exactly as he always was, contained, precise, giving nothing. Martin looked at the space on the table where a communication device should have been and wasn't. He thought about what Feld's voice had sounded like in the dark, not reporting, arguing. There had been a pushback quality to it, the rhythm of someone defending a position to someone who disagreed. The weeks that followed changed the texture of the operation in ways that were hard to describe but impossible to miss. Feld's documentation pace increased. He was at the site before anyone else arrived in the mornings, and still there when the last crew member turned in at night. He began requesting specific sections of each structure be cut in a particular sequence, deviating from the original assessment plan Martin had been given, redirecting the work toward areas Feld marked on his own diagrams that he did not share with anyone else. The armed escorts changed their positioning. They had previously stationed themselves at the perimeter of the site. Now 2 of them were always within close range of the active cutting work, not watching the wilderness, watching the crew. Martin noted all of this in his notebook in the neutral language of professional observation, equipment deployment, personnel positioning, revised sequencing protocols. He wrote it the way he wrote everything, in the dry, careful shorthand of an engineer logging site conditions. But he knew what he was actually doing. He was creating a record. Quietly, without drawing attention to it, he was writing down the things he was not supposed to be writing down. Then the chambers appeared, and everything shifted again. The first one was found, not by cutting, but by sound. One of the crew was working along the lower interior face of the second structure when his tool produced a change in tone, a shift from the dense resistant note that cutting this material always made to something briefly hollow, briefly resonant, like tapping a wall and finding the space behind it. He stopped, tapped again with his knuckle. The hollow tone came back, clear enough that 2 other crew members heard it and turned around. Feld was there in under a minute. Martin had never seen him move quickly before. He moved quickly now. He put his own hand against the surface, pressed, listened, then straightened up and told the entire crew to stop all work and return to the camp. His voice had the same flat tone as always, but his jaw was set in a way Martin had not seen before. The escorts moved the crew out without discussion. Feld stayed at the site alone for the rest of that day. When he came back to camp after dark, his coat had dust on the knees that hadn't been there in the morning. He ate nothing, said nothing, went directly to his unit. Martin heard nothing through the wall that night. Just silence so complete it felt like a held breath. The chamber was opened 3 days later under conditions Feld controlled completely. The crew was positioned at a distance. Only Feld and one of the escorts entered. Martin watched from 40 meters away and could see almost nothing. What he could see was Feld's body language when he emerged, and body language was something Martin had always been good at reading. Feld stood outside the opening for a moment before turning back toward the camp. He stood very still. His hands were at his sides. He was looking at nothing in particular, the middle distance, the way a person looks when they are not seeing what is in front of them because what is in front of them has stopped mattering compared to what is happening inside their own head. Martin had seen that look on people before. It was the look of someone recalculating everything. That evening, Feld called the crew together for the first time since the operation began. He stood in front of them in the gray evening light and told them that certain internal features of the structures had been identified, that these features were within the expected parameters of the project, and that work would resume the following morning with adjusted protocols. He said this in the same careful, flat voice he used for everything. Then he paused, and for just a moment, something crossed his face that Martin could not classify. Not fear exactly, not awe exactly. something that contained both and also contained something else underneath them, a kind of vertigo, the expression of a person who has just confirmed that the ground they are standing on extends much further down than they thought. He dismissed the crew without taking questions. As they dispersed, Martin hung back slightly and caught a clear view of Feld's hands at his sides. They were not steady. Whatever was inside that chamber, it had shaken a man who Martin had spent months watching absorb impossible information without visible reaction. And the thing that kept Martin awake that night, staring at the ceiling of his bunk in the total wilderness silence, was a thought he could not push away. If what they had already found was within expected parameters, what exactly had Feld been expecting to find? The orders came without warning on a morning that looked exactly like every other morning on the site. Martin was midway through a structural note when one of the escorts appeared at his shoulder and told him to stop what he was doing, collect his personal belongings, and be ready to move out within 2 hours. Not tomorrow, not after the current work phase was complete. 2 hours. Martin looked up from his notebook. He asked what was happening. The escort said orders had come from above to suspend operations immediately. He used the word suspend, not complete, not conclude. Suspend, as if everything might resume at some later point when Martin and the rest of the crew would not be present to see it. The camp broke down with a speed that felt rehearsed. The crew moved in the particular silence of people who have learned not to ask certain questions out loud. Equipment was left exactly where it stood. Tools mid-task, cables still running to the cutting machinery. Martin looked back at the site as they moved out, and it looked like a paused film frame. Everything frozen in the position of an interrupted action, waiting for someone to press play again. The journey back was structured differently from the journey in. On the way to the site, they had traveled as a group. On the way out, each crew member was separated at stages, redirected onto different vehicles, different routes, different destinations. Martin understood what was happening with the clarity of someone watching a magician's hands when the magician doesn't know they're being watched. The crew was being dispersed in a way that would make future contact between them logistically difficult without being obviously impossible. They were not being prevented from finding each other. They were just being made sure the paths back to each other were long enough and indirect enough that most people wouldn't bother. Martin signed the updated agreement at a nondescript office building 2 days into the return journey. The document was longer than the first one. It contained language about national interest and permanent restriction, and a specific clause he read 3 times. A clause stating that the signatory acknowledged that any materials removed from the project site remained the property of the relevant authority and were subject to immediate retrieval. He thought about his notebook. He thought about the folded itinerary still sitting in a book on his shelf at home. He signed. He had no real choice, and he knew it. He was delivered to a transit hub, handed a ticket, and that was the end of any official contact. No debrief, no follow-up, no acknowledgement that the operation had existed at all. He stood in the transit hub with his bag and his notebook, and the particular feeling of a man who has just been set down in ordinary life after a long time away from it, and who can already tell that ordinary life is not going to fit the same way it used to. He went home. He took a job that used about 1/3 of his actual capabilities. He was careful and quiet and gave people no reason to look at him twice. He did this for a very long time, but he kept the notebook, he kept the itinerary. And eventually, in a room by himself, speaking into a recorder with the deliberate calm of someone who has been rehearsing this for years, he made the tape. He made it because he had spent decades watching what happens when no one says anything. He'd watched the operation get buried under paperwork and silence, and the slow accumulation of official indifference. He'd looked for the other crew members and found one by one that several of them were gone. Not disappeared in a dramatic sense, just gone in the quiet, ordinary ways that attract no particular attention. Accidents, illnesses, lives that ended before they should have without anything to point at directly. Martin had survived. He didn't know exactly why, though he had theories. What he knew was that surviving without speaking felt increasingly like a choice he needed to answer for, not to an authority, to something quieter than that, to the part of himself that had pressed a palm against an impossible surface in a frozen wilderness and felt it push back, and had known in that moment that the world contained something that the world's official version had no room for. He made the tape so that at least one record would exist that couldn't be filed away or reclassified or conveniently lost. He addressed it to no one in particular. He left it where someone who loved him would find it, and he trusted, without being able to verify it, that the person who found it would know what to do. Laura sat in her kitchen in the early morning, the tape player on the table in front of her, Martin's voice now silent. She looked at her hands around the coffee cup and thought about the clause in the agreement she'd read in the copy he'd somehow kept. Any materials removed from the project site remained subject to immediate retrieval. She thought about the car with the same dented bumper. She thought about the search and what they'd been looking for and how they still hadn't found it. Then she thought about what Feld's hands had looked like when they weren't steady, and she started making a list. The list Laura made that morning turned out to have 7 items on it, and within 3 weeks, 5 of them led somewhere they absolutely should not have led. She started the way Martin would have started, methodically, working from the edges toward the center. She wasn't looking for the structures themselves. She was looking for the paper trail that any real operation leaves behind, no matter how carefully someone tries to clean it up. Martin had taught her that without meaning to, through years of watching him work. He used to say that every structure leaves a record of the forces acting on it. You just have to know where to look for the stress marks. The first thing she found was a procurement record from the relevant government department, partially digitized as part of a routine archive project sitting in a public records database that almost nobody used because it was slow and badly organized and required knowing exactly what to search for. The record was for industrial cutting equipment. The quantity listed was so far beyond what any normal operation of that crew size would require that whoever had processed the requisition had flagged it internally with a query note. The query note was still attached. It had never been answered. She printed it out. She held it in her hands. This was a real document in a real archive, not a story on a tape, not the memory of an old man, not something she could be told she had imagined. It was a number on a page, and the number was impossible, and it matched Martin's account with a precision that made her sit very still for a moment in the library where she'd found it. The second thing took longer. A geological survey from the same general period, filed under a classification that had technically lapsed, cross-referenced in a footnote of an entirely unrelated environmental study. She had to request the original through a process that involved 3 separate forms and a 2-week wait. When it arrived, the document was partially redacted, whole paragraphs blacked out, but what remained was enough. One surviving sentence described recovered material samples displaying non-organic structural patterning inconsistent with known natural formations. Another described the survey team's recommendation that the zone be closed to all non-authorized access pending further analysis. The words "further analysis" had been underlined by someone, by hand, in pen, at some point after the document was printed. She photographed every page. The third item on her list was a researcher named David, who had attempted to reach the zone years earlier as part of an independent environmental study. She found him through an academic contact who mentioned him carefully, with the particular care people use when they are telling you something they've been advised not to mention. David was alive, working quietly at a small institution, and when Laura reached him, he was silent on the phone for long enough that she thought the call had dropped. Then he said he'd been wondering when someone would call. They met in person. He was a careful man with the specific caution of someone who has been through something that left marks. He told her about the restricted zone, about the personnel with no visible unit markings who had turned his team back, about the equipment they were carrying that was not consistent with environmental monitoring. He pulled out his phone and showed her a photograph he had taken in the seconds before being directed away, a clearing, partially visible through trees. In the clearing, shapes that the distance and the angle made ambiguous, but which matched, in their general scale and placement, exactly what Martin had described. Laura looked at the photograph for a long time. David said he had tried to publish a reference to the restricted zone in an academic paper once, a single sentence, no details. The sentence had been removed from the final version by his department head, who had cited concerns about unverified claims. David had not pushed back. He had a family, he said, without elaborating further. Laura understood what he meant. She went home that evening and sat at her kitchen table with her photographs, her printed records, and Martin's notebook, which she had kept in a different location from the tape and which the search of her apartment had not found. She spread everything out in front of her and looked at it the way you look at something that is finally resolved from a blur into a clear image. It had the particular feeling of a thing snapping into focus that you have been staring at for a long time without being able to see. The structures were real. They were documented fractionally in records that had survived the cleanup through bureaucratic accident and the ordinary chaos of large institutions that cannot perfectly control everything they contain. The zone was still restricted. David's photograph existed, the procurement record existed, the geological survey existed, and Martin's notebook, 40 years of an engineer's precise handwriting, existed. None of it was enough on its own. All of it together was more than anyone had managed to assemble before. She started writing. Here is what I think about when I think about Martin and what he left behind. He was not a brave man in the obvious sense. He did not confront anyone. He did not go public. He did not sacrifice his safety for the truth in any dramatic way. He was, by his own account on that tape, a man who made a bad decision at 34, lived with the consequences quietly for the rest of his life, and found one small way to make sure the record was not completely blank. He pressed record. That was all. One deliberate act in a locked room, alone, with no guarantee that anyone would ever hear it. And that one act turned out to be the thing that nothing they did afterward could fully undo. The zone is still restricted. The satellite images of that region, in the highest resolution versions, have been replaced with degraded older versions that show nothing useful. If you try to access detailed current imagery of the specific coordinates Martin described in his notebook, you will find that the available data stops being clear at exactly the boundary of the area in question, as if someone drew a line and said, "Not here," and someone else made sure the line held. That kind of boundary does not exist for empty wilderness. It exists for places that contain something someone does not want examined. Laura published what she had. Not in a dramatic way, not all at once. She placed the documents in multiple locations, physical and digital, in ways that meant removing one copy would not remove the others. She shared Martin's account with people she trusted to handle it carefully. She is careful herself, the same way Martin was careful, because she understands now that careful is not the same as silent. Careful is how you make sure the thing you're carrying survives long enough to reach someone who can do something with it. The structures are still there, under new growth, under official silence, under a restricted airspace designation that lists no reason in any public registry. Martin touched one and felt it push back. The warmth he felt in that frozen wilderness was not residual, it was active. Something in those structures was still functioning, still running whatever process they were built to run, long after everything around them had changed beyond recognition. Think about that for a moment. Whatever those structures were designed to do, they were still doing it, quietly, without any human involvement, in a place that officially does not contain anything of interest. The world we are told we live in is the version that fits inside certain boundaries. But boundaries are not facts, they are decisions. And every decision to draw a line around something and say nothing to see here is also a decision about what you are allowed to know about the place you actually live. Martin spent his whole life being careful. His one act of anything else was pressing record, and here we are. So here's the question I want to leave you with. If you found out tomorrow that something fundamental about the world had been deliberately kept from you, not by accident, not through ignorance, but through a conscious decision made by people who decided you didn't need to know, what would you actually do with that information? Think about it honestly. Write your answer below, because I think the answer to that question says more about where we are as a civilization than almost anything else. If this story made you think, if it made you feel something, share it with someone who asks questions. Subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps this reach the people who need to hear it.